This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This show is all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Toop, the Director of Ministry at ODB Films, and today we look at Distributism. This was a suggested topic from my good friend Mitchell, who's a longtime listener and just kind of a wonderful friend, and I had no idea what he was talking about when he brought it up. I was not really familiar with the conversation, but then the more I dug into it, the more I realized this is like a really popular socio-economic strategy, and it's closely associated with the Catholic Church, but not a lot is known about it. It's usually known as like an economic theory that got really popular with Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton. And they themselves, however, they claim that the theory was basically rooted in the social teaching of the church, especially Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, the church's first two major social encyclicals. Now, Distributism remains fairly controversial. Okay, a lot of people accuse it of really kind of just advocating for like an altered form of socialism, and it's been put forward as a means between kind of the extremes of communism, which eliminates private property, and capitalism, which concentrates property in the hands of a few. So it's a hot topic. I'm glad we're doing a show on it. Now, let's break it down. So essentially, Distributism advocates for an economic and political system which creates favorable conditions for the distribution of property and capital into the hands of as many people as possible. Now, it does not seek to collectivize property or to favor ownership only by the wealthy, but actually calls for family-owned businesses and local economics. So if you understand it in this kind of general way, you can obviously see how the ideas underlying basically the theory, okay, they're rooted solidly in the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Now, to show this, what I want to do is I'm going to just kind of quote very relevant passages from social encyclicals and one radio address from the popes, just so that we can kind of unpack what it means. But there's 2 points we want to tackle first as we get into the show. It's not specifically Catholic, but it kind of is specifically Catholic. Okay, so Distributism is based on philosophical ideas. Now, contrary to the understanding of a lot of people, philosophy is not the same as theology or religion. It's a separate field, even if the topics overlap. I know that I have a degree in philosophy and theology. I'm telling you, there was some overlap, but they were two very different theses and two very different final tests, okay? Now, a lot of the principles put forth by Distributism, they can be also found in the teachings of other religions and cultures from around the world, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily faith-based. So a lot of the philosophical teachings that are the basis of Distributism, they predate Christianity. Aristotle advocated a lot of the same positions as Distributist. Therefore, right, these philosophical views, they can't be said to have been specifically Catholic. Now, additionally, just as there isn't one strict form of government compatible with Catholicism, there's not just one economic system that's compatible with Catholicism. So it's possible to have a capitalist system that's compatible with Catholicism, but a lot of elements currently accepted as part of capitalism throughout the world, like usury, would have to be removed from it to do so, okay? Now, Distributism is Catholic in some ways. It's a distinct economic view that came into being as a result of papal teaching. Popes addressing issues of economic and social justice, they wrote encyclicals. They inspired groups of Catholics to form a movement that attempted to kind of present those issues and solutions to them to the wider public. So this movement really took the name of Distributism or Distributivism, although its founders actually kind of voiced their desire for something different. Although this movement included non-Catholics from the beginning, the positions advocated by Distributists are really consistent with Catholic teaching on economic and social justice. In other words, this whole thing consists of philosophical positions on economic and social structures that are compatible with the Catholic faith. So you can no more separate Distributism from Catholic teaching than one can separate the original Constitution from the writings of the philosopher John Locke, okay? So it's that close. Okay, here's what we want to do. It's a little bit of a different format for the show. I just really want to dig into what the popes actually say, what they're saying. And so it's going to be a little bit of a different format, but rather than philosophically just theorize what we're talking about when we mean distributing wealth, I don't want philosophical conjecture. What we want is the papal conjecture. Where is this coming from? So what I'm going to read are these passages from the actual popes, and then we'll just sort of stew on them, and we'll see what we come up with, okay? So Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, 1891, major social document. Section 13, he says, "The right to property, therefore, which has been proved to belong naturally to individual persons, must likewise belong to a man in his capacity of head of a family. Nay, that right is all the stronger in proportion as the human person receives a wider extension in the family group." So it's rooted in family ownership. He says in section 46, "If a workman's wages be sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children, he will find it easy, if he is a sensible person, to practice thrift, and he will not fail by cutting down expenses, to put by some little savings and thus secure a modest source of income. Nature itself would urge him to do this. We've seen that this great labor question cannot be solved by assuming as a principle that private ownership must be held sacred and inviolable. The law," Pope says, "therefore should favor ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the people to become owners." So here's the thing. Private property is important. He continues, "Many excellent results will follow from this, and first of all, property will certainly become more equitably divided." So the idea is that ownership is good, that we all need it, so let's make sure everybody has the opportunity to be owners. That is actually kind of a bold socio-economic statement on behalf of the Pope. Okay, Pope Pius XI and Quadragesimo Anno 1931, section 57, he says this. He says, "The riches that economic social developments constantly increase ought to be so distributed among individual persons and classes that the common advantage of all, which Leo XIII had praised, will be safeguarded. In other words," the Pope says, "that the common good of all society will be kept inviolate. By this law of social justice, one class is forbidden to exclude the other from sharing in the benefits." This is your Pope writing, okay? 1931. This is, Hitler was elected in 33. That's what's going on in the world. This is when he's writing, okay? Class warfare shouldn't exist, is what he's saying. Next section, 58, he says, "To each, therefore, must be given his own share of goods, and the distribution of created goods, which, as every discerning person knows, is laboring today under the gravest evils due to the huge disparity between the few, exceedingly rich, and the unnumbered, property-less, must be effectively called back to and brought into conformity with the norms of the common good, that is, social justice." Again, this is Pius XI saying this in 1931. Last statement by him in this particular letter that's relevant to our conversation. He says this, "Therefore, with all our strength and effort, we must strive that at least in the future, the abundant fruits of production will accrue equitably to those who are rich and will be distributed in ample sufficiency among the workers." Okay, this is the Pope, again, writing this, talking about the benefits of distributing wealth, because not all labor is equal, not all property is equal, but that there is equitability that's desired among the labor force. I know what that sounds like, but I'm telling you, this is a papal encyclical, okay? Pope Pius XII, in a radio message, September 1st, 1944, he says this, "But above all, the Church strives to make private property become, according to the plans of divine wisdom and nature, an element of the social order, a necessary presupposition for human initiatives and a stimulus for work. All this must be turned toward the advantage of the temporal and transcendent goals of life, and therefore toward improving the liberty and dignity of man, created in the likeness of God, who, from the beginning, determined that man should use the material creation for his own advantage." He continues this, "The worker should be offered the possibility to acquire goods as personal property, what better stimulus can you give to him than to encourage him to work hard, to save money, to be sober in order to do so, especially when so many men and peoples, having lost everything, have no other resource today than their capacity to work. Okay, this is a big deal. In 1944, you're seeing a very powerful advocacy from the Pope for labor, the power of labor. Now, in our little American world in 2019, and we'll get into this in a minute, we have this, it's what feels like this polar tension between the parties that's just kind of like, well, you just want to receive money and do nothing. And then over here is, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get yourself out of poverty. Both are just grotesque, hasty generalizations of the populace. But what you see in this Pope is saying that labor has inherent value, that the value of our abilities to contribute and receive really comes back to our abilities to labor. Okay. And I know it's 1944, but just think about that language, because that language gets dangerously close to that, what we love to condemn as socialism or communism, instead of in the context of healthy capitalism. And I know for some of you Renovo listeners, you've probably already turned the show off. Okay. Like you're just like, what are you talking about? Let me tell you what, this is a big deal. This is your church speaking specifically to a political temperature, and it's naming specific socioeconomic strategies. And I don't know how many people out there in the pews are actually finding a balance between their Democrat and Republican tendencies. Your church has spoken to in-depth socioeconomic philosophy. You should actually know what that means, okay? Pope St. John the 23rd, Mater et Magistra in 1961, his encyclical, stay with me, this is good stuff. Section 115, he says this: now, if ever is the time to insist on a more widespread distribution of property in view of the rapid economic development of an increasing number of states, it will not be difficult for the body politic, by the adoption of various techniques of proved efficiency, to pursue an economic and social policy which facilitates the widest possible distribution of private property in terms of durable consumer goods, houses, land, tools, and equipment in the case of craftsmen and owners of family farms, and shares in medium and large business concerns. This policy, he says, is in fact being pursued with considerable success by several of the socially and economically advanced nations. He goes on, section 168, he says, increase in production and productive efficiency is, of course, sound policy, and indeed a vital necessity. However, it's no less necessary, and justice itself demands, that the riches produced by distributed fairly among all members of the political community. This means that everything must be done to ensure that social progress keeps pace with economic progress. Again, every sector of the economy, the Pope says, agriculture, industry, and the services must progress evenly and simultaneously. That's a bold statement. Why are colleges so expensive that no one can afford them in the working and the lower classes, who are the ones who need them the most? That would be an example of this imbalance, okay? So the extreme capital side would be like, you either make your money or you don't, too bad if you don't. And the extreme communist side would be, distribute all of it equally to everybody, da-da-da-da-da. That's not what this is saying on either side. Those are two extremes that are weird and don't work, okay? What he's saying is there a way to find a balance of distributive justice? And distributive justice is something that was really well pioneered by John Rawls, great philosopher, great thinker. Might look into him. He can unpack this in a lot of detail in a little bit more of a secular way, but this is your Pope. This is your Pope in 1961 writing this. Okay, it gets better. So St. John Paul II, Laborum Exercens, 1981. Here's what he says. Thus, merely converting the means of production into state property in the collectivist system is by no means equivalent to socializing that property. We can speak of socializing only when the subject character of society is ensured. That is to say, when on the basis of his work, each person is fully entitled to continue himself a part owner of the great workbench at which he is working with everyone else. A way towards that goal could be found by associating labor with the ownership of capital as far as possible, and by producing a wide range of intermediate bodies with economic, social, and cultural purposes. They would be bodies enjoying real autonomy with regard to the public powers, pursuing their specific aims in honest collaboration with each other and in subordination to the demands of the common good. And they would be living communities both in form and in substance, in the sense that the members of each body would be looked upon and treated as persons and encouraged to take an active part in the life of the body. This is Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, clearly articulating cooperative business, where the laborer owns part of the business. They might not own all of it, but they're financially invested in the success of the business. And friends, again, I actually really don't care what your politics are. I hope they're informed by faith. I hope your politics doesn't inform your faith. I hope it's the other way around. But this is arguing for this idea of the ability to share successes because of our labors, our abilities to labor. We'll talk about being able to serve the non-laboring another time. What I'm talking about right now are the working masses in a cooperative way, instead of funneling all kinds of profits to one place, okay? He continues in another encyclical, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, 1987, Pope St. John Paul II, he says this, paragraph 9, "We are therefore faced with a serious problem of unequal distribution of the means of subsistence originally meant for everybody, and thus also an unequal distribution of the benefits deriving from them. And this happens not through the fault of the needy people, and even less through a sort of inevitably dependent on natural conditions or circumstances as a whole." He continues in section 28, "Of course, the difference between being and having, the danger inherent in a mere multiplication or replacement of things possessed compared to the value of being, need not turn into a contradiction. One of the greatest injustices," St. John Paul II says, "in the contemporary world consists precisely in this, that the ones who possess much are relatively few, and those who possess almost nothing are many. It is the injustice of the poor distribution of the goods and services originally intended for all." That's a pretty concise statement on behalf of what distributism is, all right? He says this again. Pope John Paul II writes about this stuff all the time. Centesimus Annus, 1991, section 43, he says this, "In the light of today's new things, we have reread the relationship between individual or private property and the universal destination of material wealth." He says, "Man fulfills himself by using his intelligence and his freedom, and in so doing, he utilizes the things of this world as objects and instruments and makes them his own. The foundation of the right to private initiative and ownership is to be found in this activity. By means of his work, man commits himself, not only for his own sake, but also for others and with others." St. John Paul II, he continues, "Each person collaborates in the work of others and for their good. Man works in order to provide for the needs of his family, his community, his nation, and ultimately all humanity. Moreover, he collaborates in the work of his fellow employees, as well as in the work of suppliers and in the customers' use of goods, in a progressively expanding chain of solidarity. Ownership of the means of production, whether in industry or agriculture, is just and legitimate if it serves useful work. It becomes illegitimate, however," he says, "when it is not utilized or when it serves to impede the work of others in an effort to gain a profit which is not the result of the overall expansion of the work and the wealth of society, but rather in the result of curbing them or of illicit exploitation, speculation, or the breaking of solidarity among working people. Ownership of this kind has no justification," St. John Paul II says, "and represents an abuse in the sight of God and man." Wow. Wow. Pope Benedict XVI, Caritas in Veritate, 2009, section 42. He continues this thesis by saying this, "Despite some of its structural elements, which should neither be denied nor exaggerated, globalization a priori is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. We should not be its victims, but rather its protagonist, Pope Benedict says. Acting in the light of reason, guided by charity and truth, blind opposition would be a mistaken and prejudiced attitude, incapable of recognizing the positive aspects of the process, with the consequent risk of missing the chance to take advantage of its many opportunities for development. He continues, the process of globalization, suitably understood and directed, open up the unprecedented possibility of large-scale redistribution of wealth on a worldwide scale. If badly directed, however, they can lead to an increase in poverty and inequality and could even trigger a global crisis. He continues, it is necessary to correct the malfunctions, some of them serious, that cause new divisions between peoples and within peoples, and also to ensure that the redistribution of wealth does not come about through the redistribution or increase of poverty, a real danger if the present situation were to be badly managed. That's Pope Benedict XVI. Okay, how about this? Pope Francis, Laudato Si, 2015, Section 94, very clearly states, the rich and the poor have equal dignity, for the Lord is the maker of them all, Proverbs 22:2. He himself made both small and great, Wisdom 6:7, and he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, Matthew 5:45. He continues, this has practical consequences, such as those pointed out by the bishops of Paraguay. And then he quotes this document. He says, every campesino has a natural right to possess a reasonable allotment of land where he can establish his home, work for subsistence of his family, and secure a life. This right must be guaranteed so that its exercise is not illusory, but real. That means that apart from the ownership of property, rural people must have access to means of technical education, credit, insurance, and markets. Wow, talk about distributism, okay? Section 112, he concludes, yet we can once more broaden our vision. We have the freedom, Pope Francis says, needed to limit and direct technology. We can put it at the service of another type of progress, one which is healthier, more human, more social, more integral. Liberation from the dominant technocratic paradigm does in fact happen sometimes, for example, when a cooperatives of small producers adopt less polluting means of production and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community. Okay, I know this was a lot. I know it was, but take it in. All of it. These are our popes teaching us an understanding of distributing among the masses. And here's the thing. Distributism strikes a balance between two principles of the church's social teaching, the universal destination of goods and the defense of private property. That's two really big ideas. So it creates this condition for more widespread private ownership, enables more people to participate in the goods of the earth, which God destined for the common good of all, right? That's the point. So this collection of text, all these letters, all this writing, it's made it very clear that the church does indeed teach that the distribution of goods and property fulfills God's intentions for human work, our labor, right? And the demands of justice on earth. And there is much more to be said as to why this is the case and how this should be done, particularly creating like an environment which favors ownership, small business, and a strong local economy. But hopefully the show, the text that we read, hopefully it kind of inspires you to learn a little bit more about how our work, our labor can and should fulfill God's plan for our own work and how we can help others to realize the same. That's the essence of distributism. Thanks for listening. Sincerely, we're partners in the journey of faith. I really hope you share this Renovo podcast with friends and foes. Send your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Friends, always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.